At exactly 6 minutes past 8, on a rainy Monday morning, my chief executive officer looked down at his watch, tapped the glass face, and spoke in a voice loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. He told me that I was 6 minutes, that it carried a $500 penalty, and that I could either pay it or clean out my office. I stood there, rain dripping from the hem of my coat, and almost laughed. Just 4 hours earlier, at 2 minutes past 4 in the morning, I had signed the largest contract in our company's 47-year history. I thought he was playing some sort of poorly timed joke. He was not. His face was cold, his posture stiff, and he looked at me with a smirk that told me he had been waiting for this moment. I had no idea that those 6 minutes would eventually cost him his career, his reputation, and the very company he was running. My name is Richard Henderson. I was 59 years old, and I had spent 35 years working for Nova Industrial Solutions in Dallas, Texas. I started with the company back in 1991 as a junior salesman with a used pickup truck, a borrowed suit, and a willingness to work 80 hours a week. I built my career from the dirt up, not by analyzing spreadsheets, but by doing the hard work that never shows up on a corporate report. I returned every call within an hour. I kept my promises even when it cost us money, and I always remembered the people behind the contracts. Over the decades, I watched Nova grow from a small local distributor into a regional powerhouse. I rose through the ranks to become the Senior Vice President of Business Development, managing our largest accounts and maintaining relationships with customers who had trusted me for more than 20 years. For 6 months, I had been negotiating with Summit Aerospace Manufacturing over a 5-year, $240 million contract. The final negotiations began on Sunday afternoon at our headquarters. The representatives from Summit were tough, dissecting every clause and demanding concessions on delivery schedules. We went back and forth, refining the service level agreements, reviewing the quality control protocols, and calculating our margins. By midnight, the coffee was stale and the tension in the room was thick. Our chief financial officer, who had been sitting in on the call, looked exhausted, but I refused to let the momentum slip. I knew the Summit team, and I knew what they needed to hear to close the gap. We pushed through the night, resolving the final details of the liability clauses. At exactly 2 minutes past 4 on Monday morning, the lead negotiator for Summit smiled, signed the document, and slid it across the table. When the contract was finalized, our chief financial officer shook my hand and told me that I had just made company history. The deal was done. I was exhausted, my eyes burning from the harsh office lights. I decided to sleep for 90 minutes at a motel down the street rather than driving all the way home, knowing I needed to be back at the office by 8 to prepare the files for the board. I woke up to the sound of heavy rain beating against the window. I got into my car and immediately hit a wall of red taillights. A major multi-car accident on Interstate 35. Wait, Interstate 35 had shut down 3 lanes of traffic, turning the highway into a parking lot. At 7:48, recognizing that I was going to be delayed, I dialed my assistant, Olivia. I asked her to find the chief executive officer, Gavin Pierce, and let him know that I was caught in the gridlock but was driving as fast as the weather allowed. Olivia confirmed that she would deliver the message immediately. When she spoke to Gavin, he simply replied with a short, cold acknowledgement, saying my message was noted. I finally pulled into the parking lot, ran through the pouring rain, and stepped into the lobby at 6 minutes past 8. Gavin was waiting. Gavin was 41 years old, the founder's son-in-law, who had been appointed chief executive officer 18 months prior. He was a man who believed that leadership was about control, rules, and authority. He had no sales experience and absolutely no respect for the people who had built the company before his arrival. He checked his watch in front of several employees and vendors. He announced my 6-minute delay as if it were a major breach of security. I explained the accident on the highway and reminded him that I had just closed the $240 million Summit deal. Gavin did not care. He stated that company policy required a $500 penalty for any senior executive arriving late without prior written approval. He looked at me and said I could either agree to have the $500 deducted from my salary or hand over my security badge. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but there was none. I asked him what policy he was referring to, as I had never heard of such a rule in my 35 years at the company. He refused to answer, simply repeating the demand. I looked at Gavin, then down at the blue security badge in my hand. 35 years of loyalty ended with one small piece of plastic. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I walked to the reception desk, placed my badge on the counter, and told him that I would choose the second option. I walked toward the elevator to pack my office, leaving Gavin standing in the lobby, his face frozen in surprise as he realized I was not going to play his game. Packing my office was a quick and quiet affair. I walked into the room that had been my second home for decades, pulled a cardboard box from the supply closet, and began clearing the shelves. I packed a framed photo of my wife Helen and our daughter Claire, an old Navy coffee mug with faded gold lettering that had survived my time in the service, and a stack of leather-bound notebooks filled with handwritten notes, client names, and reminders of personal details that no database could ever capture. Olivia, my assistant, stood in the doorway, her hands trembling as she fought back tears. She told me that she had given Gavin my message at 7:49 and that he had looked at his watch and smiled when she told him about the accident. She whispered that the entire office was in shock, that people could not believe Gavin would do this after the summit contract was signed. I looked at her, smiled gently, and told her not to worry. I told her that a job is just a place where you work, but your character is who you are, and no one can take that from you. As I walked out of the lobby with my box under my arm, I ran into Toby, a young intern I had been mentoring for the past 6 months. Toby had his notebook in hand, looking confused and frightened by the sudden silence that had settled over the floor. He stopped me and thanked me for the time I had spent teaching him how to handle difficult clients and how to listen more than he spoke. I put my hand on his shoulder and gave him one final piece of advice that I had learned over my 35 years in business. I told him that people will eventually forget the numbers on your slides, and they might even forget what you taught them, but they will never forget how you treated them. Then I walked out into the rain, placed my box in the passenger seat of my truck, and drove home. The weeks that followed were some of the most difficult of my life. I was 59 years old, a time when most men are planning their retirement rather than starting over. I contacted several recruiters, and their initial responses were filled with enthusiasm when they saw my track record. They praised my experience, my connection to major industrial buyers, and the volume of business I had managed. But when we sat down for interviews, the tone shifted. They would look at my graduation dates, ask how many years I planned to work before retiring, and then politely explain that their clients were looking for someone with a longer runway, which was just a polite corporate term for someone younger and cheaper. I watched our savings account, knowing that our retirement plans were now in jeopardy. I worried about health insurance, our mortgage, and whether I would ever find another role in the industry to which I had dedicated my life. My wife, Helen Henderson, refused to let me fall into despair. Every morning, she would make coffee, sit with me at the kitchen table, and go over my list of contacts. When I expressed my doubts about finding another company that would value a 59-year-old salesman, she looked at me with the fierce determination that had supported me through 3 decades of marriage. She told me that maybe I was not supposed to find another company where I could work. She suggested that after 35 years of building someone else's business, it was time to build my own. She said that my value did not belong to Nova or to Gavin Pierce. It belonged to me, and it was time to bring it home. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Diane Albright, the vice president of procurement at Summit Aerospace. She had heard rumors of my sudden departure from Nova and wanted to know what had happened. I explained the situation honestly, without bitterness, detailing the lobby scene and Al Gavin's demand for the late penalty. Diane was silent for a long moment, and then she let out a dry laugh. She told me that Gavin was a fool who did not understand the business. She said that while Nova had the contract on paper, I was the one who had the relationship, the trust, and the expertise. She asked me if I had considered starting my own consulting company. She explained that if I did, Summit Aerospace would want me to oversee the implementation of their industrial supply contract. She made it clear that they wanted me answering their calls, not a group of junior analysts who did not know the difference between a high-pressure valve and a standard fitting. The next morning, I turned our garage into an office. Helen bought a second-hand desk from a local thrift store, and Claire, our daughter, built a simple website outlining my services. I ordered business cards that read Richard Henderson Consulting. The first month was incredibly quiet. I sat at my new desk in the garage, staring at the phone, wondering if I had made a massive mistake. The silence was downtime, and the old doubts began to creep back into my mind. I was 59, working out of a garage, trying to compete with multi-million-dollar firms. But then the phone rang and the real work began. The first call came from a medium-sized manufacturing firm in Fort Worth that had been a client of mine for 12 years. The owner told me he had heard I left Nova and wanted to know if I could review their supply chain operations. A week later, another long-term client called, asking for help with their vendor negotiations. I slowly began to realize that I had not lost my 35 years of experience when I placed my security badge on the reception desk. I had carried those 35 years with me, locked in my mind and in the relationships I had nurtured. The garage office began to hum with activity. Meanwhile, former colleagues from Nova started calling my personal cell phone. Olivia called one evening, her voice tense. She told me that the atmosphere at Nova had become toxic since I left. Gavin had used my departure as an opportunity to accelerate what he called a management modernization plan. In reality, it was a systematic effort to push out experienced, higher-paid employees and replace them with younger managers who would not question his decisions. He had forced 3 senior account directors into early retirement and replaced them with young graduates who knew how to build beautiful slide decks but had never visited a factory floor. Olivia said the employees were terrified to speak up, fearing they would be fined or fired for minor infractions. Then Toby called. He was still an intern, but he was being asked to handle accounts that were far beyond his experience level. He told me that after I left, Gavin had divided my old role as senior vice president among 4 younger managers, each of whom was paid a fraction of my salary. None of them knew the history of our clients, the specific technical requirements of their orders, or how to handle issues when they arose. Toby said that 2 major clients had already threatened to cancel their orders due to communication breakdowns and delayed shipments. The most revealing call came from Walter Jenkins, the retired chief operating officer of Nova. Walter had spent 30 years at the company and had been my close friend and mentor. He had retired 2 years prior, but still held a significant number of shares in the company. Walter told me that he had been reviewing the internal quarterly reports and noticed that Gavin had taken full credit for the Summit Aerospace contract in his presentation to the board of directors. The board had been led to believe that Gavin's new operational policies were the sole reason the deal had closed, and my name had been completely erased from the project documents, reduced to a footnote about administrative support. Walter was furious. He told me that he had contacted several other retired executives and major shareholders who were growing concerned about the direction Gavin was taking the company. They were seeing a rise in customer complaints and a drop in employee morale. Walter asked me if I would be willing to meet with a lawyer to review the situation. He explained that he was gathering evidence to present to the board, and he wanted to make sure they had the complete, unvarnished truth about Gavin's management practices. I agreed to meet with Walter and a seasoned labor attorney named Donald Mercer. We met at a quiet diner in North Dallas. Donald listened carefully as I described the events of my termination, the $500 penalty Gavin had demanded, and the systemic replacement of older managers. Donald's eyes lit up as I explained the details. He told me that Gavin's actions had exposed Nova to massive legal liabilities under federal and state laws. He explained that we had several powerful legal weapons at our disposal, and if we presented them to the board, it would force a major reckoning. First, Donald pointed out the Texas Labor Code, Section 61.018, commonly known as the Texas Payday Law. He explained that in the state of Texas, an employer is strictly prohibited from making any deductions from an employee's wages unless the deduction is authorized by law, ordered by a court, or authorized in writing by the employee. Gavin's demand for a $500 salary deduction for being 6 minutes late, without any written policy or employee consent, was a direct and flagrant violation of state law. Second, Donald raised the Fair Labor Standards Act, specifically the salary basis rules for exempt employees under Title 29, Section 541.602 of the Code of Federal Regulations. He explained that because I was a salaried executive, my pay could not be docked for partial day absences or minor lateness. By implementing a policy that docked salaries for minutes of lateness, Gavin had jeopardized the exempt status of every executive in the company. If their exempt status was lost, Nova would be legally required to pay back taxes and overtime wages to all senior staff for the past 3 years, a liability that could easily reach millions of dollars. Finally, Donald noted that the systematic pushing out of senior managers to replace them with younger workers was a classic violation of the Federal Age Discrimination in Employment Act. He said that we had a strong case for age-based discrimination, not just for me, but for the other 3 directors who had been forced out. Armed with this legal analysis, Walter prepared a formal brief to present to the board of directors. And we waited for the right moment to strike. In mid-November, the chairman of Nova's board of directors, a respected industry veteran named Edward Harrington, contacted Walter Jenkins. Edward was deeply concerned about the company's performance. The stock price had begun to slide, and the board had received a formal warning letter from Summit Aerospace regarding quality control issues and delivery delays on the newly signed contract. Walter told Edward that the problems were the direct result of Gavin's management decisions, and he requested an emergency board meeting to present our findings. The board meeting was scheduled for the first Monday in December at the headquarters in Dallas. I was asked to attend as a witness. As I walked into the building where I had spent 35 years of my life, I felt a strange sense of detachment. The familiar lobby was the same, but the energy had changed. The employees I passed looked stressed, keeping their heads down and avoiding eye contact. Gavin Pierce was already in the boardroom, sitting at the head of the long conference table, looking confident. When he saw me walk in with Walter and Donald Mercer, his face hardened, and he demanded to know why an ex-employee was present in a private board meeting. Edward Harrington stood up and told Gavin to sit down. He explained that the board had called this meeting to address the critical issues facing the company, and they would hear from anyone who had relevant information. Walter took the floor first. He presented the board with a 70-page report detailing the operational decline of the company over the past 6 months. He showed that customer retention had dropped by 15%, employee turnover had tripled, and the implementation of the Summit Aerospace contract was 3 weeks behind schedule. Then Donald Mercer stood up and presented the legal brief. He explained to the board that Gavin's attempt to dock my salary by $500 was a direct violation of the Texas payday law. He showed the board the email correspondence between Olivia and Gavin, proving that my assistant had notified him of the highway accident before 8. Donald then detailed the federal implications under the Fair Labor Standards Act, explaining how Gavin's late penalty policy threatened the exempt status of the entire executive team, exposing the company to millions of dollars in back pay liabilities. He also presented evidence of systemic age discrimination, showing a clear pattern of older, experienced managers being replaced by younger workers. Donald Mercer explained that under the Fair Labor Standards Act, an exempt employee must receive their full salary for any week in which they perform any work, regardless of the number of hours or days worked. He explained that making deductions for minor lateness of minutes is a clear violation, as it treats salaried professionals like hourly workers. He stated that if the Department of Labor audited the company, they would likely reclassify all managers as non-exempt, forcing Nova to pay 3 years of retroactive overtime. The board's legal counsel, who was sitting in the corner, nodded grimly and confirmed that Donald's analysis was entirely correct. Gavin looked around the room, realizing that his legal advisors were not going to defend his actions. Edward Harrington then asked Gavin if he had informed the board about these risks. Gavin stammered, claiming he had consulted with outside advisors, but he could not produce any names or documents. One of the board members, an elderly woman who had been a close friend of the founder, looked at Gavin with open disgust. She remarked that his actions were a complete breach of the trust the founders had placed in him. She stated that the company was built on integrity, not on bullying tactics and illegal wage docking. The board members listened in stunned silence. Edward Harrington turned to Gavin and asked him to explain the $500 late penalty. Gavin, his face turning red, blustered that it was standard company policy designed to enforce discipline and operational efficiency. Edward then turned to the head of human resources, who was present in the room, and asked if there was any such policy in the official employee handbook, or if the legal department had ever approved it. The human resources director went pale and admitted that there was no such policy. She stated that Gavin had ordered her to implement the penalty for senior staff, and that she had raised concerns but had been told to follow orders or face termination herself. She added that she had kept a written record of Gavin's directive in her private files to protect herself from legal liability, which she was now prepared to share with the board's legal counsel. The tension in the room was electric. Gavin tried to defend himself, arguing that as chief executive officer, he had the authority to implement operational rules to manage his team. But the board members were shaking their heads. They realized that Gavin's arrogance had not only cost them their most experienced leader, but had also exposed the entire corporation to severe legal and financial risks. They were staring at a potential class action lawsuit from former employees, a federal audit from the Department of Labor, and the loss of their most lucrative contract. Just as Gavin began to argue, Edward Harrington stopped him and announced that they had one more witness to introduce. He tapped a button on the conference phone, and the large screen on the wall came to life, showing Diane Albright from Summit Aerospace. Diane looked calm and professional, sitting in her office in Chicago. Edward welcomed her and asked if she could share Summit's perspective on the current status of the contract. He sat back in his chair, folding his hands. While the other board members leaned forward to catch every word, Diane did not hold back. She stated flatly that Summit Aerospace had selected Nova Industrial Solutions because of Richard Henderson. She explained that they had worked with me for 20 years and trusted me to deliver on my promises. She said that since my departure, the communication from Nova had been amateurish and disorganized. She noted that the 4 junior managers who had replaced me did not understand the technical requirements of the aerospace parts, resulting in 3 separate shipments of non-compliant materials that had delayed their assembly lines. She warned the board that Summit's legal team was currently reviewing the contract and was preparing to terminate the agreement for cause, citing a failure to meet the required quality standards and service levels. Edward Harrington asked Diane if there was anything Nova could do to restore Summit's confidence. Diane looked directly at the camera and said that the only way Summit would continue to work with Nova was if I was personally overseeing the contract. She added that they had already retained my consulting firm to advise them on the project, and they would follow my recommendations. After she finished, the screen went blank, and the room was silent. Edward Harrington looked at Gavin Pierce and asked him to step out of the room. Gavin stood up, his face pale and his hands shaking, and walked out. The board asked me to wait in the reception area. I sat on the leather couch next to Olivia, who smiled and squeezed my hand. We waited for about 40 minutes. The heavy wooden doors of the boardroom finally opened, and Walter Jenkins walked out, a broad smile on his face. He told me that the board had voted unanimously to terminate Gavin Pierce as chief executive officer, effective immediately, citing a breach of fiduciary duty, unauthorized personnel actions, and exposing the company to major legal liabilities. As I walked down to the parking garage, I saw Gavin. He was standing by his luxury car, holding a cardboard box filled with his personal items, his desk nameplate, a silver pen holder, and a framed diploma. It was the exact same scene I had experienced 6 months earlier. We looked at each other, but neither of us spoke, and strangely, I felt no satisfaction or joy in his defeat. By then, I had realized that I no longer needed revenge. My value had never belonged to Nova, and watching Gavin lose his job did not make my business any more successful. I simply got into my truck and drove away. A year later, Richard Henderson Consulting had grown to 7 full-time employees, including Olivia, who had resigned from Nova to join me as my office manager, Walter Jenkins, who served as our senior advisor, and Toby, who had completed his internship and was now our junior associate. We built our firm around one core principle that Gavin Pierce had forgotten: respect. One rainy morning, Toby arrived 15 minutes late for a meeting with a new client. I saw the familiar fear in his eyes as he walked into my office. He was breathing heavily, holding his wet umbrella, and his papers were slightly damp. He began to apologize profusely, explaining that his car had stalled in the rain and that he had tried to call but his phone battery had died. He expected to be fined or reprimanded. Instead, I looked at him, smiled, and asked if he had eaten breakfast yet. He looked confused, shaking his head. I handed him a $20 bill and told him to go down to the bakery and get some pastries for the meeting. When he stammered that he was late, I told him that he had been early every single day for 6 months. I told him that one morning does not define his character and that we manage people, not clocks. That was the moment I truly understood my victory. It was not watching Gavin Pierce lose his job or seeing Nova struggle. It was realizing that the trust and respect I had spent 35 years earning could never be taken by a security badge or an arrogant executive. A company can take your office, your title, and your badge, but they can never take your integrity. A few weeks before Christmas, Diane Albright sent me a handwritten card thanking me for saving their project and reminding her that trust is built long before a contract is ever signed. I kept that card on my desk because those 6 minutes did not destroy my career. They gave me the courage to build a life where my worth was decided by me.